So you guys really like my new shoes?
Yeah, they're solid.
I'm gonna say it's solid.
Do you like these ones better, or do you like the green ones that I have better, the mint green ones?
Are they like legit, or are they like Temu?
No, they're legit.
Okay.
They're legit.
I'm just
They're
checking.
from StockX.
Okay.
So shout out to our sponsor of
There you
this
go.
podcast,
Jacob,
StockX
do you mind
Detroit.
grabbing your cell phone?
Of what? Moving it?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Man, I gave you such a good intro, and Jacob's cell phone just had to ruin it.
I'm like paying so much attention to Jen right now. I'm like,
Brandon is
she's,
like
she's not gonna
ready
she's not
at the
gonna,
start.
Yeah,
I
I'm,
was
like,
you're not
literally
gonna
about to
do
turn and be like, Jen, what do you got for us today?
I'm listening for the keyword this
And then
time.
Jacob's cell phone had to ruin it.
Sorry. Well, we were talking about birthdays, and I think it's a great segue to talk about creation versus evolution.
Yeah, because with birthdays we were created. Yeah.
We were born.
We
That's
were born.
That's what I tell people when.
Well, no,
it's
we
their
were created before our birthdays.
Yeah,
This is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, technically, right?
I mean, technically, because he knew us before we were in our
We were
mother's
predestined.
Yeah.
So this is like a whole nother episode.
Well, and we
we're
were
going
actual human beings before we were born.
to. Yeah.
Well, like
So there's
physically
multiple
birthed.
levels of creation.
So you're not
that
talking about
happened
like,
before.
yeah, okay, all right.
So did we evolve?
So is it? So do we?
I need a happy conception day.
Do we need-
for sure? Yeah.
Do we celebrate that and then celebrate
Yeah.
the actual day? Because like
Do you mean I could have had 2 days to celebrate myself every
Wow.
year that
You
I've been
could've.
missing out on?
you could have.
Have you guys ever found yourself in an actual conversation with someone who does not believe in creation?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's talk about it. What was it like?
Tense. I think there's I think when you get into this discussions, oftentimes it can be tense because there's really strong apologists on both sides, and oftentimes people hold these worldviews with a certain amount of conviction. So I don't find that oftentimes when you get into this, there's kind of a, oh yeah, that's fine. It's like, you're wrong, I'm right. End of like.
Unless you have a friend like I do who supports everybody and everything that they do. And then she was like, I love that for you. I love that you believe in that and it brings you joy. And I say, thank you.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was.
That's not a bad friend.
No, she's a great friend.
Yeah.
She's a great friend, and she encourages us in so many ways, and supports all that we do, and that includes coming to church. So hey, it's a win-win. But yeah, it's interesting to have those conversations with people, and then it's even more interesting when you have the conversations where they do believe in creation, but they don't believe in a literal 7-day creation, or they question that and wrestle with that, and then so there's always kind of
A lot of nuance.
it's never as black and white as my shoes.
She was going to do her best to get those
I
kicks
know,
in this
somehow.
episode.
That's right.
That was skillful.
Well
That was
done,
skillful.
You're
Ravae.
welcome. You're welcome.
Well
I did
done.
it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Jacob. Like, I've had so many discussions about this, and I've had some that are similar to what you just described, but also a lot of them actually go. We talk less about the details and the nuances of creationism versus evolution itself, and more about the presuppositions that cause one to think that, oh, creationism is what's correct, or evolution. So a lot of times we don't even get into like the details of the fossil record and all of that. We more focus on like, okay, what's your starting place, and why is your starting place actually legitimate or not? So,
Right. I feel like we should rewind a minute though, and I feel like we should define what we say is creation and what we would say is evolution, just to kind of give a broader context to what we're referring to here. So why don't you take creation and why don't you take evolution?
Yeah, I saw her left hand go creation, so
Yeah.
I figured that was for you. That was a signal.
So first, Jacob, what do we mean when we are talking about the creation part of creation versus evolution?
Yeah, so we're talking about that there is a divine design and really a divine, I don't want to say energy, that feels odd, but essentially, yeah, it sounds, but
A defined
Causation.
Like a divine,
causation, there you go. Yeah,
causation
a
or
divine
being.
causation
Got it.
that brought what we know in the universe, in reality, into existence.
Okay.
So, and
Yes,
that was formed and designed. It
So
didn't
there is a
happen.
creator.
There's a creator
who made creation.
Yes.
Okay.
But I think even then I would define that a little further than just creator and creation, because I would even distinctively broaden creation distinct from like a theistic evolution, maybe for the sake of this discussion.
What is a theistic evolution for those who may be watching who don't know what that term means?
Yeah, so theistic evolution is the idea that God essentially initiated the beginning of evolution, but everything that we know in reality has evolved naturally, meaning that the design of creation is actually from evolution, not from God, where I think we would define creationism as not only that there is a creator, but there is an act of design that is the fabric of reality.
Okay.
So.
And then on the flip side, what are we defining as evolution?
Yeah, and I think that's actually, I don't want to misspeak, but I'm pretty sure that's the position of the Roman Church too, the theistic evolution. I have to double check that. Anyway, so evolution refers to, commonly when we think about it, we're thinking about Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution, of course, refers to Charles Darwin, the naturalist from the mid-19th century, who had a book called On the Origin of Species. And in that, he posited this idea or this theory of evolution where species evolve or change over time, and natural selection. And the fact that natural selection is sort of a synonym for how do I describe it? The idea where the strong...
survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest.
Yes, thank you. Thank
See,
you.
we would get there eventually.
You know, honestly, I was going
to
to say it a couple minutes ago, and I doubted myself.
No.
Don't ever doubt yourself, Jen.
We will never doubt the disembodied voice. we appreciate
the voice
that.
from behind the scenes.
Yes. Yeah, so those are the key parts of the theory of evolution. Now, in our modern day, there are theories of evolution. There's neo-Darwinianism, there's theistic evolution, there's like a whole bunch of different ones, but that's the focus of what evolution entails.
Okay, so you bring up Darwin, which
and then I'm sorry, let me describe one other thing.
Okay.
Differentiate between microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution focuses on differences within a kind. And so, so I'll give an example of that in a second. So microevolution, and then macroevolution refers to larger changes over a larger period of time. We wouldn't necessarily find an issue with microevolution, but macroevolution within the context of Darwinian evolution is where we would find an issue. So Darwin originally sort of postulated some of these ideas because he spent time on the Galapagos Islands, spent about 5 years or so, and he was observing the beaks of this bird called finches. And he noticed that some had longer beaks and some had wider ones, and that it seemed to evolve over time to help them to better survive, to feed or whatever. And so that was part of the impetus for his theory of evolution. Then it sort of goes into other avenues from there. But, yeah.
My dad spent some time on the Galapagos Islands, but he didn't come away with any theories.
No,
he didn't write a book.
No, he didn't write a book. He didn't do any of that stuff. No, so I was doing some reading about creation and evolution stuff, and I found it interesting in one of the things that I was reading that Darwin, at some point in his life, and I don't know if it's before or after or when, but he was a believer. Like he was a Christian. So it kind of makes me wonder that even though I know at the end of his life, apparently some tragic things happened. We're not here to talk about all that. And he did renounce his faith. But it makes me kind of wonder is when he first created evolution, did he create it because he wanted to give something that shows the lack of a creator? Or did it come out of maybe that theistic. I'm like, can I talk today?
Yeah.
Theistic.
Not thespian evolution. That's a different thing altogether. So
the theater. I can't say the word. I can't say it.
Theistic.
So you know what I'm talking about. Did he come from that mindset maybe where in the back of his head he did have this creator in mind and then it moved towards this
Yeah, I don't know specifically of Darwin himself. I don't know if you know more
I'm not
about
sure about
him,
that,
Brandon.
that
But I
aspect
think
of it.
what's interesting if you do note the time period in which he wrote, there was a big movement prior to Darwinism towards deism, and really towards the removal of the miraculous.
Okay.
So like that, I mean, you go back and like Thomas Jefferson famously cut out parts of his body. Like there was a big movement of kind of removing God from an intimate involvement in creation, and kind of he's just kind of out there somewhere. So when Darwin comes along and postulates the idea of evolution and the origin of species, whether he wanted directly, it seemed like a cultural moment where culture was already kind of moving that, and this gave a linchpin, whether it was him directly or others, to even remove God further from the concept of how we because science, I mean, and then we go into all the history, right, of the Enlightenment and the move towards the embrace of science, and really the movement towards scientism is kind of that flow in history that was really emerging at the time. And
which fun fact, we have a Everyday Theology episode that talks a lot about scientism, so definitely check that out. I mean, what are your thoughts?
No, I think that's totally right. I don't know about Darwin a lot about his biography, personal biography, just more about like sort of what he wrote about in the origin on the origin of species. One thing that I think was really interesting that he wrote in there, he had this phrase that's become like kind of popular, but he said a warm little pond. And I don't want to take this too far. I don't want any like hardcore biologists or scientists watching this to say, "Oh, that is what he," that's not.
Yeah,
what he
don't
said.
come for us.
Yeah. but he questioned whether the origin of life sort of came about in like a warm little pond. He was just using that as an example to say like, hey, there had to be this time where all these different molecules and amino acids and all these things sort of came together, and that was sort of the spark of life. But then see, I think that's one of the, and we're kind of going into the issues with evolution, the theory of evolution now, is that I think one of the primary issues is on the origin of life, whereas we have these two silos, right? One category would be for the evolutionists. They would say that there was a natural spark or origin to life, right? Mm-hmm. But for the creationists, we would say that it was a supernatural origin to life. And so like, no matter what, let's just say it was a warm little pond or whatever illustration one uses, well, there were still molecules or the water from that pond or whatever in existence to start and they don't have a way of positing a first cause, whereas we would say God is our uncaused first cause. And so that's why I said at the beginning, a lot of my conversations focus more on that part, because if you don't have a good foundation that's like the starting foundation for these theories. If you don't have a sturdy foundation, then the rest of it kind of falls by the wayside.
It's like that. There's like this big effect that happens, but there's no cause.
Yeah.
But every cause has an effect, and every effect has a cause. I don't know. The warm pond sounds like it's full of dirty bacteria in this place that I don't want to be.
Everyone ever want to go in a warm pond?
I don't want nothing to do with that warm pond. Yeah. Come out with like folliculitis or whatever that's called that you get at lakes.
But even another thing that Darwin brought up, and he was very honest in a lot of aspects of his book. The issue with the eye itself, our eyes are so incredibly complex. A lot of biologists and scientists actually compare them to cameras, the way in which they work or whatever. But Darwin actually said the eye gives him, this is a direct quote from him, the eye gives him cold shudders at night. Like that's something that still perplexed him, because if the eye evolved, then at one time our eyes didn't work, but there's no evidence that our eyes didn't work to the same capacity that they do now. So anyway, there's a lot of other things that we can talk about, but that was one thing that he also mentioned.
For you guys, as you've navigated these conversations, I think one of the things I've found is it often feels like when you get into discussions, especially when you, even in just culture in general, there's like this assumed veracity to evolution, right? That it's fixed, it's true, it's almost indisputable, like that it has all this evidential backing. And then you come over on the creation side and it's like, well, that's kind of a theory and we'll poke all the holes, and you can't really trust that in Scripture. And so it almost feels like it's challenging within discussions because you're like already starting from a negative, right? It already seems like when you have a conversation with someone, they have all this evidence and truth, and you're over here and everyone's kind of looking at you like, well, you're just making up fairy tales because it's from the Bible. We can't even trust that anyway. Like, how do you think we navigate these conversations culturally when you almost feel like you're starting at a deficit at times? Like, how have you navigated, or how has that been for you guys?
I think that's such an important point that you bring up there, because I think probably the vast majority of people that are watching this video are not folks who are steeped in biology or archaeology, the fossil record, or different parts of science. They're normal, everyday folks who probably have some type of understanding, some surface level like we do. But to your point, you get in these conversations and you do feel like, you go to most of the museums and most of them talk about like the fact that or the idea, not the fact, that we evolved from apes or whatever it is. So I think that is right, and that's why this conversation is so important. That's why I mentioned at the beginning, I like to focus more on the presuppositions that we come into it with. Like, what is that foundation that you have for assuming that the origin of life just sort of came out of nothing? And furthermore, with natural selection, there's a randomness to it. So if there's a randomness to it, we know that in our society, we often talk about morality. We talk about things that are good and that are bad, obviously. And we focus on, or we talk about things in an objective manner as well. So if one's perspective is that all of life came into being randomly, with no direction, no actual creator, then there's no, again, objective standard with which to judge morality or other things. We talk about purpose too. Purpose is a lot of things that people are constantly seeking. But if this is an unguided process by which we came about and continue to evolve, then there's no real objective purpose that we have. So I think that a lot of the existential ideas that people grapple with on an everyday basis also kind of fold into the bigger issues around evolution and creationism. And that's where I like to more focus instead, because to be honest, I know some about the fossil record. I don't know a whole lot, and I'm not going to go do a bunch of research on it. I know some about the Cambrian explosion and how that has some issues with evolution as well, but I'm not going to do a whole bunch of research. But the foundation is so important. So that's where I like to sort of start.
Truth be told, I have not debated creation and evolution like heavily in my life. I mean, I remember like in elementary, middle school, upper elementary, middle school, like at public school talking about it. But then like I went to Christian school, then I went to Christian college, and I avoided science classes like the plague because I'm not good at science. So I like took physics because it was math, basically. But I have found in some of the stuff that I read or in small kind of conversations with family members or things like that, that I have really yet to see something where science would disprove a creator. So like when they're talking about evolution or they're talking about all these scientific things that they're testing to prove evolution's real, they haven't really disproved that there's a creator. And I've kind of noticed that as a theme in some of these conversations that I see or watch or, see on an Instagram reel or something, that there's just no like firm thing that says this disproves the existence of God and that God is the creator. And so for me, I kind of, in my mind, like to answer their question with a question and be like, well, can you tell me what disproves a creator? Because most of the time when they start talking about those scientific things, it still points back to a creator. Like you mentioned Darwin with the eye. Like if we're all evolving and we evolved into this big thing, but we're perplexed about the eye, well, doesn't that point back to maybe that there was like an intricate design that something or someone or a divine being had to have thought of?
And I think that's an important reality for us as we navigate these conversations, because I think the truth is, and probably if you're more pro-evolution, you might disagree with this, but I'm happy to dialogue about it in the comments below. But I think the truth is, like, there's almost this assumption that to believe in evolution, to trust in evolution, like, it doesn't require any faith. It's almost like we're the faith side, and that's fact.
Yeah.
But if you actually get into the details, there's a lot of things that are assumed and where there's faith in those who postulate evolution. I mean, that's one of the things I think. I just read an article recently in a book on theistic evolution. I love the chapter title because the guy basically said, I'm paraphrasing, evolution is a grand story without a mechanism. And his whole point was, it's a great theory, but they still don't actually have a mechanism that explains how one organism changes to another organism. There's no scientific evidence that has ever been shown that that's possible. So you have a great idea, but it's a faith that says, I believe this happened some point back then because we can't reproduce it now, and that's influence. Like, to me, I look at that and say, like, well, that's as much faith as some of the things that we hold, right? The question is, and so that's one thing. I think we need to recognize there's that starting point. And I think if you recognize that, then the next question becomes, well, what's the narrative that your belief is postulating? And that's where I think you get into those questions. Like you said, Brandon, now we have to have questions about morality. What is moral in the world based on an evolutionary worldview versus a Christian worldview, right? How do ethics come into play? What are other areas of knowledge that we can learn and assume as humanity? Because I think scientism says it can only be this vain, but that really limits the scope of what human knowledge is and how we approach it. And so that's the stuff I think we are able to engage in those conversations better, because I think most people avoid them because they feel like they have all the information and I just have my faith and I got to be in this corner. And at some point when you realize they're actually acting on faith as much as we are in some ways, then we can at least, like, if we're humble enough, have constructive dialogue instead of like hostile dialogue.
Right, because creation and evolution, I mean, with the evolution side, it doesn't really talk about the good versus evil. Like, did that just evolve out of nowhere? Like, that whole ethics and moral compass, that seems to me like a very different thing than just, the flip book that you got as a kid where the monkey turned into the human from the fish to the that whole thing. Like,
I think here's one of my things I would love. I call this my Thanos challenge, right? So we're all comic book
like
fans
Thanos was
here.
right. Is that what you're saying?
No, here's the question, right? So remember, Thanos' whole argument in Marvel and Infinity Wars was essentially that you had to eliminate half the planet for the survival of the planet and the species, right? That was his whole point. Now, how can you say objectively from a evolutionary worldview that Thanos would be wrong in that circumstance? I don't know where your moral grounding would come, because if he could prove actually this is going to create better flourishing for the humans that stay, this is going to be better for the planet itself, this is going to produce long-term good in the species, like, at some point, I don't know where your moral framework could come and say, actually, Thanos, you're wrong, and we need to defend you and silence you because half these people have value. Like, those are the questions that I think, and some will say, well, evolution's not meant to do that, it's just a scientific theory. But we're all working with a worldview. So how does that influence your worldview?
Right.
Framework. Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah. Sometimes
it's an interesting test anyway.
It is
or maybe
an
it's just an
interesting
excuse
test.
to talk about Marvel.
It is. But see, here's the thing. I do that when sometimes when I'm driving, I think in the back of my mind, Thanos was right. Maybe half the population's gotta go. Not for real,
That's
guys.
just when you're behind a slow driver
like
in the
when you're
left.
behind,
You're like, if I could just remove half these people.
Or like when you're people who don't know how certain things work, and I'm like, do we not know how the banking system and the drive-through ATM works? Like, it's a different conversation for a different day, Brandon.
But, I mean, Brandon, throw this my way. No, I think both of you raised good points, and I mean, this is what when we think about the scientist Stephen Hawking that passed away. To your point, evolution is not it won't disprove God. It seeks to provide an alternative to creationism or whatever else. But the question then becomes, to your point, like, when we have these alternatives, then which one makes the most sense? Which of these worldviews, when we think about all the different aspects of morality and the origins of life and what one's worldview has to say about the afterlife or whatever, like how do these comport with reality and the things around us? So
yeah. So as we kind of like wrap up this conversation, I feel like we need to give something for people to like walk away with and like do kind of like a homework assignment, but it's not really homework. Like let's call it research.
Research.
Yeah, like personal research. If you were talking to someone and they came to you and said, "Hey, Jacob or Brandon or even me, I can answer the question too. I want to know more about creationism and know more how to defend it and engage in conversation with those who don't believe it. What's one step that they should take, or one thing they should look at, one thing they should read, or kind of
let
do?"
me give one additional thing I meant to mention actually earlier. The Bible is not meant to be a science book.
Right.
That is not the purpose of it. So sometimes those who espouse evolutionism will try to argue certain things from the Bible. Well, the Bible doesn't say this, or it doesn't say that, or is wrong about this. That's not the purpose of the Bible. Mm-hmm. So just be like, don't get into those debates.
Maybe that's a good thing for people to keep in mind as well. That's like a good factor, is that when you're talking to someone and they bring that up, say, well, the Bible is not a science book. Yeah. It's God's word. So.
Yeah. And so one other practical thing that I'll mention, like a resource. I would just go back to what I said earlier, and that's to focus more on the presuppositions that one holds to how they get to them holding to either evolution or whatever it is. Because I think that not only will that help to clarify for you what you actually need to address with them, because you can have all this knowledge in your head, right? Mm-hmm. But they might not even know half of that stuff, so you'd be wasting your time. Mm-hmm. So that allows you to really understand what their point is. And also, we've talked about this before with listening and stuff like that and asking questions, that it might convey to them a compassion from you that you actually care about their perspective, even in the midst of disagreement. We can be different, but not, have a difference, but not divide over it. So that's a practical application. But a resource, I would say the ministry Reasons to Believe. I find them, Fuzz Rana and Hugh Ross and that whole group, I find them to be very thoughtful on this topic, on a number of topics dealing with science. And the point is, even if you don't agree with their conclusions, it'll lead you to other resources, and you'll know that these are folks that have thought this through very carefully. So you can rest assured in that. Mm-hmm. So Reasons to Believe is a great ministry to look into.
What about you?
I would tell you what not to do.
Okay, that's good too.
Don't watch the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate. So that would be a good starting point.
Don't watch Bill Nye, the science guy?
They had the debate a few years ago.
At the Creation Museum.
Yes.
That.
And pretty much everyone looked at it and said, this is not a good representation of either side.
At all.
So
now you know a bunch of people are going to look it up, right?
Yeah.
I know. They are now. And I'm probably going to get some hate mail for this from probably fans of Ken Ham or Bill Nye. So either one. So sorry. But no, I think, and I only use that as a launching point to say, these conversations do take a lot of nuance and understanding to engage well. And that's where it's hard to say, here's a definitive resource. I think you mentioned one, there's some trusted resources, but recognize most of us are not trained scientists. Mm-hmm. So that's not going to be like the best area to engage. I think though, having some understanding of what are some of the arguments on both sides, and instead of just assuming, what are the good reasons that we have? I think one of the books I would say that could be really helpful in that, I found to be helpful, is a book called Theistic Evolution. So it kind of deals with both, because it both kind of critiques evolution, but it also critiques those who assume evolution from a potential Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And I think the articles, Grudem, J.P. Moreland, there's several top thinkers, and they come at it from both a scientific and a philosophical perspective. I think there's some really good stuff in that book. It's heady. So, but that's the thing. You're not going to find, I don't think, simple resources because you're getting into nuanced realities of worldview. I think the biggest thing that I would say then is like, we should challenge ourselves. Like if you're curious, do the work. It's okay. Like it's okay to do the work and challenge yourself and read and study.
Yeah.
And there are good resources. You mentioned a great starting point.
Yeah.
And I think there's others that we can lean into. So
I have one last quick thought or question for you guys. Do you think that with the rise of a lot of progressive Christianity that we're seeing more, self-professing Christians believing in things like evolution?
Oh, for sure we are. I mean, if you look at like Biologos, there's a whole movement of Christian. I mean, that's where theistic evolution really is the idea. Like, I think you have some major compatibility issues between what we see in Scripture and what we see in to assume evolution.
And I think that leads into a bigger conversation, and maybe it's another fun episode we have conversation here, but it leads into a bigger conversation of the Christians picking and choosing what parts of the Bible they want to believe, how they want to adapt. I think we touched on it a little bit when we were talking about like manifestation and New Age stuff, how there's certain things that people take from that, there's certain things that people take from Christianity, and they try to blend them and marry the two together and try to find some justification for, well, if this can exist with this together, and that's not necessarily the case with creation and evolution, I would say.
Yeah, I think unfortunately in that movement, it actually undermines Scripture as a source of knowledge, and in a desire, and often in progressive Christianity, to kind of connect with the culture. What we unintentionally do by assuming evolution is we undermine and say, well, this has the higher value in society, therefore I have to determine even my own worldview based on this, which inadvertently kind of pushes the Bible to the background and says, well, we can't really trust this. We got to kind of, and so even in the seeking of connection, we actually end up undermining, which I think is one of my big concerns with kind of enfolding evolution into the faith in that kind of way. So,
ditto.
Well, I would tell everybody that they should check out Brandon's blog that he's going to write about this.
I am.
Because he's going to have a lot of great thoughts, maybe some tips and tricks, I don't know.
Perhaps.
And maybe some better resources than what I have off the top of my head, hopefully.
And maybe some excerpts from the Bill Nye and
from Bill Nye.
I'm gonna take that heat from you, brother.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Well, what about you guys? What do you think? What are some of the questions that you have regarding creation versus evolution? Drop them in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. And thanks for joining us. Can't wait to see you again for another conversation at Everyday Theology.
Thanks for watching Everyday Theology. If you'd love to see more of this content, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button.